The elevator doors slid open to a silence too perfect. Ethan Monroe's shoes echoed across the marble floor of his penthouse as he dropped his suitcase. The billionaire hadn't planned to come home early, but the board meeting in London ended ahead of schedule. He expected to find his 3 sons asleep, maybe the maid cleaning up the dinner mess. Instead, he heard whispering, soft, rhythmic, almost like singing. He followed the sound down the hall and stopped cold at the nursery door. There, on the carpet, his boys knelt beside Keisha Williams, their black maid. The lamp cast a golden halo around them as her calm voice filled the room. "Thank you, Lord, for keeping their mamas safe in heaven," she whispered. The boys' tiny hands were folded tight, eyes closed, their small voices echoing hers. Ethan's breath turned sharp. "What the hell do you think you're doing with my children?" he barked. The words shattered the moment. The boys froze. Keisha looked up, startled but not afraid. "Mr. Monroe," she began softly. They were crying. They just wanted— "You don't teach my kids anything," he snapped, stepping forward. "Least of all your superstition." "Sir," she said gently, "it's not superstition. It's comfort." I said stop. His voice thundered through the room. "You don't pray in my house. You don't touch my sons. Pack your things." "Daddy, no." Eli cried, rushing to Keisha's side. "She didn't do anything," little Leo shouted, tears breaking. Ethan's jaw clenched, pride stronger than reason. "Out, now." Keisha rose slowly, eyes wet but steady. "Yes, sir," she whispered, gathering her things. When she reached the door, she turned one last time. "They just needed someone to listen," she said quietly. "You might try it sometime." The door closed behind her with a sound heavier than anger. Silence. 3 small boys clung to each other on the carpet, whispering her name like a prayer that had nowhere left to go. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening and the world needs to hear them. 3 months earlier, the Monroe penthouse had felt like a museum, cold, spotless, and silent. Ethan's wife had passed away a year ago, and no nanny lasted more than a week since. The boys screamed, fought, hid, or cried until each caretaker walked out in tears. Then one afternoon, the doorbell rang, and a quiet woman stood there with a small suitcase and tired eyes. "Keisha Williams, sir," she'd said politely. "The agency sent me." Ethan barely looked up from his laptop. "Just keep them under control," he muttered, waving her in. The first hour was chaos. 5-year-old Leo dumped a box of cereal across the kitchen floor. Benji hid her phone on the couch. Eli locked her inside the laundry room for 20 minutes before the security guard freed her. Most people would have quit. But when she walked out, dusted off her apron, and smiled, the boys stopped laughing. "You can keep trying," she said gently, "but I'm not leaving today." That night, she sat on the carpet between their beds, reading softly from an old storybook. Leo's head slowly rested on her shoulder. Benji stopped pretending to sleep. Even Eli, the toughest one, peeked through half-closed eyes. By the end of the week, the tantrums faded. By the end of the month, laughter returned. Keisha taught them how to plant herbs on the balcony. Things grow when someone cares. She taught Leo how to calm his fears during storms by counting heartbeats. She taught Benji to draw his feelings instead of shouting them. And when Eli refused to talk about his mom, she didn't force him. She just sat quietly beside him until he spoke first. Mrs. Lyle, the elderly housekeeper, noticed a change. "That woman's got patience heaven can't teach," she'd said. But Ethan didn't notice much. His meetings, calls, and stock prices filled every hour. He liked order, not warmth. Discipline, not emotion. Until one night, he caught sight of his sons asleep, arms wrapped around Keisha's handmade quilt, and something inside him shifted. Unfamiliar, unwanted. He quickly shut the door before the feeling could grow. Because sometimes, even light scares those who've lived too long in darkness. The slam of the door echoed long after Keisha was gone. Ethan stood frozen in the hallway, chest tight, jaw locked. He could still hear her last words. They just needed someone to listen. The line looped in his head like a song he didn't want to remember. He poured himself a drink he never tasted and stared out over the city lights. New York glittered like nothing had happened. But upstairs, the nursery sounded like heartbreak. 3 small voices whispering for the woman he'd just thrown out. "Daddy, you made her cry," Benji said through the door. "Go to bed," Ethan muttered. His voice cracked halfway through. The next morning, the penthouse felt heavier than before. Breakfast was burnt toast and silence. The boys sat at the table, eyes red, plates untouched. "Eat," Ethan ordered. No one moved. "Where's Miss Keisha?" Leo asked quietly. "She's not coming back," Ethan replied. "Why?" "She broke the rules," he said, eyes on his coffee. Eli's voice cut through the stillness. "She didn't break anything." "You did." Ethan's hand froze around the mug. "I'm your father," he snapped. "I decide who stays in this house." Eli's stare didn't waver. "She stayed when you didn't." The words hit harder than any insult. Ethan turned away, pretending to check his phone. His chest burned with something he couldn't name. Shame, maybe. Guilt, definitely. After breakfast, he walked through the room she used to clean. The scent of cinnamon still lingered faintly in the air. Her folded blanket sat neatly on the couch. A tiny paper crane, Leo's handiwork, rested on the table beside it. He didn't touch it. He couldn't. When night fell, he found himself standing outside the boys' room again. They were awake, whispering under the covers. "She's coming back, right?" Leo asked. Eli's voice was steady but small. "She's not." Ethan turned away before they could see him standing there, his throat closing up. He'd face investors, senators, even death rumors in the press. None of it hurt like this. 3 children who looked at him like the villain in their bedtime stories. And for the first time in years, Ethan Monroe felt powerless in his own house. If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe. Ethan sat in his office, the city lights flickering beyond the glass like ghosts. He hadn't touched his food in 2 days. Every corner of the penthouse reminded him of her. The folded blankets, the untouched balcony plants, the faint smell of cinnamon that refused to fade. He opened the boy's sketchbook lying on the table. Inside, in shaky crayon lines, Leo had drawn 3 stick figures and 1 tall woman in the middle holding their hands. Above her head, in bright yellow letters, the word safe. Ethan's chest tightened. He closed the book slowly, his hands trembling. Mrs. Lyle appeared at the doorway, her voice gentle. "Mr. Monroe, the boys didn't eat much again." "I'll order something," he murmured. She didn't move. "They don't need delivery, sir. They need you." He looked up, irritated. "I'm doing my best." "No," she said quietly. "You're doing what's easy. They needed softness, not orders." That's what she gave them. Her words landed heavy. She left the room, leaving silence behind. Ethan stared down at his own reflection in the glass. Expensive suit, perfect tie, empty eyes. That night, he tried cooking for them himself. It was clumsy. He burned the toast, oversalted the soup, and dropped the plate that shattered across the marble floor. The boys peeked from the hallway, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "It's edible," Ethan said awkwardly. Benji sniffed the bowl. "Miss Keisha made it better." "I know," Ethan whispered. "I'm trying." Eli didn't reply, but he sat down first. Then Benji, then Leo. They ate quietly. The soup wasn't good, but for the first time since she'd left, the house didn't feel dead. Later that night, Ethan stood on the balcony, city wind cold against his face. He looked at the 3 small potted plants Keisha had helped them grow. 2 were wilting. 1 still stood, stubborn and green. He knelt beside it, touching the soil with shaking hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered, to her, to the kids, maybe to himself. Then he stood, grabbed his phone, and called the agency. "This is Ethan Monroe," he said. "I need to find someone. Her name's Keisha Williams." The agency line crackled. "I'm sorry, Mr. Monroe," the woman said stiffly. "Ms. Williams resigned. No forwarding address." Ethan's jaw tightened. There must be something, an emergency contact, a reference, anything. Sir, she sighed. She left on good terms. Quiet woman. Said she was moving in with a friend in Brooklyn. That was all he needed. 2 hours later, Ethan's black SUV pulled up on a cracked sidewalk under a rusted fire escape. Children played hopscotch on the pavement, and the smell of fried food drifted through the air. It was a world far from the glass towers he called home. He hesitated before knocking. The door opened halfway. Keisha stood there, wearing a faded hoodie, her curls tied back, eyes steady but distant. "Mr. Monroe," she said quietly. He swallowed. I didn't expect you to open the door." "I almost didn't." They stood in silence for a beat. "I came to say I was wrong," he finally said. "About everything. About you." Her voice didn't shake. "You fired me for praying with your children." "I was angry," he admitted, "and afraid. You reminded me of everything I tried to ignore. Faith, love, grief." Keisha's gaze softened slightly, but her arms stayed crossed. "I didn't pray to teach them religion. I prayed so they'd stop feeling alone." "I know," he said, lowering his eyes. "And I made them more alone." From inside the apartment came the faint hum of a gospel song. The air smelled of cinnamon and soap, the same scent his sons missed every night. "I'm not here to ask you to come back," Ethan said. "I just needed to tell you that you mattered, that you healed something in that house no money ever could." Keisha sighed, the kind of sigh that carries months of pain. "I stayed for those boys, Mr. Monroe. They needed to feel safe. I can't be that peace if their father isn't willing to learn it too." He nodded slowly. "Then teach me, please." She studied him, reading his face for the first time without fear. "Sit," she said softly. "I'll make tea." He exhaled, almost collapsing into the chair as she walked to the small kitchen. The kettle hissed, filling the silence between them. For the first time, Ethan wasn't giving orders, defending pride, or pretending control. He was simply a man waiting to be forgiven. The next morning, sunlight spilled to the Manhattan skyline as Ethan's SUV pulled once more into the circular drive of the Monroe penthouse. But this time, he wasn't alone. Keisha sat beside him, hands folded neatly in her lap, gaze steady on the glass towers rising ahead. She hadn't promised to stay. She'd only said, "Let's see if change is real." Inside Mrs. Lyle was arranging flowers in the foyer when she looked up and froze. "Miss Keisha," she whispered, eyes wide. Keisha smiled softly. "Hello, Mrs. Lyle." Ethan took a deep breath. "Would you call the boys, please?" The housekeeper nodded quickly and disappeared down the hall. Moments later, footsteps thundered across the marble floor. Benji appeared first, barefoot, pajama collar crooked. He froze mid-step, eyes widening. "Miss Keisha?" She crouched down. "Hey, sweetheart." Benji's lip trembled before he launched himself into her arms. Leo followed, dragging his blanket, whispering, "You came back." Keisha hugged him tight. "I never stopped caring for you." Then came Eli. He didn't run. He just stood at the doorway, watching. Ethan's heart pounded. "Eli," he began, but the boy cut him off. "Did you fix it?" Ethan knelt so their eyes met. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "I hurt someone good. I made all of you pay for my pride. And I'm sorry." Eli's jaw clenched. "You pushed her." "I did," Ethan admitted, "and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Eli looked at Keisha. "Is he telling the truth?" She nodded gently. "He is." The boy's shoulders loosened. He stepped forward and placed his hand in hers. "Then stay," he whispered. Benji cheered, Leo giggled, and for the first time in months, laughter filled the house again. That evening, they ate together in the kitchen, not in the formal dining room with silverware and crystal, but around the small table where warmth replaced wealth. Keisha made grilled cheese and tomato soup. Ethan nearly burned the bread, and they all laughed. Benji spilled milk. Leo burped. Eli rolled his eyes but smiled anyway. When the boys went to bed, Keisha stood by the balcony, watching the city lights. Ethan joined her quietly. "Thank you for giving me another chance." She turned to him, voice calm but firm. "This isn't about chance. It's about change." He nodded. "Then I'll keep changing for them and for myself." She looked at him for a long moment before saying softly, "Good, because they'll remember what you do, not what you say." He smiled faintly. "Then I better start doing better." Behind them, the house was finally alive again, not perfect, but whole. Morning light stretched across the penthouse floor like forgiveness. Keisha stood in the kitchen, humming softly as she flipped pancakes, golden, light, and warm. The smell drifted through the halls, pulling sleepy footsteps toward the table. Leo was the first to appear, hair messy, eyes half open. "Smells like love," he said, rubbing his eyes. Keisha chuckled. "Smells like you're hungry." Benji climbed onto his stool. "Don't burn like Dad did." From behind, Ethan's voice came low and teasing. "One time, Benji, one time." He entered wearing a plain shirt and no tie. The billionaire stripped down to something human. He moved easily around the kitchen now, pouring juice, helping without being asked. "Morning," he said to her. "Morning," Keisha replied. "You cook before coffee again?" He smiled faintly. "Learning priorities." Eli joined them last, carrying his sketchbook. He didn't say much, just sat beside his brothers and started eating. When Keisha looked his way, he gave a small nod, a quiet truce. For the first time, they ate as a family. No rules, no walls, just laughter and the soft clinking of plates. Ethan watched them, eyes shining. "This," he said, almost whispering, "is what home was supposed to feel like." Later, the boys ran to get ready for school, their chatter echoing down the hall. Keisha rinsed the dishes, while Ethan leaned on the counter. "You've changed this house," he said. She shook her head. "We did. You just had to remember how to listen." He paused. "You ever regret staying?" Keisha smiled gently. "You ever regret learning?" He laughed under his breath. "Touché?" The sound of small sneakers slapping marble floors filled the air. "Bye, Miss Keisha," the boys shouted as they ran out the door. "Bye, my loves. Be kind today," she called back. When the door closed, the apartment didn't feel empty. It felt alive. Ethan joined her by the window. Sunlight poured over the balcony plants that had once withered. Now they stood tall, green, reaching for the light. He looked at her, voice soft. "You were right that night." "About what?" "They just needed someone to listen," he said. Keisha smiled. "So did you?" Outside, the city roared awake, but inside, peace lingered, fragile, real, and earned. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it.